the map, that's the full map. So if you've seen the cover of the book, there's the coffee beans and the title, and then a piece of this map. But this is a much larger section of the Catalan Atlas from the 1300s. So, so that's what it looks like. I'm not sure you could use it to get anywhere, but it looks great. So, so there you are. And these are just two of my very favorite quotes about coffee. You can see them there. "O coffee, thou dost dispel all care. Thou art the object of desire to the scholar." It's an anonymous poem from 1511. Interestingly enough, this opening of the first coffee house in Mecca. And then Mahmoud Darwish from 1982, "Coffee for an addict like me is the key to the day." And oh yeah, oh for sure. So unless they're labeled, the photos are mine. Otherwise, I have tried to attribute them properly, just so I don't get into any trouble. So let's get started. So this book came about actually because I wanted to try to think about, well, I started thinking about chocolate because I was giving a talk for the admissions office at Carroll College, and I wanted to talk a guest lecture, and I wanted to talk to the students about something other than the kind of normal stuff. So I did a history of chocolate, and I didn't want to really write about that, but I did want to write about food. And I came across coffee because the more research that I did, the more I realized that coffee provided a thread, if you will, a way to think about all of these different kinds of histories. So for sure, it's about the history of food and foodways, what we eat, how we eat, who we eat it with, what we don't eat. My students often do not think of that. What do we not eat? Has there been times in history when there are people we don't eat with? I mean, maybe not we, but people don't eat with. So it's about the history of food and foodways. It's about place. Coffee originated in a very defined place in Ethiopia and the highlands of Yemen. And so there's a geographic element to understanding the history of coffee. It's about acquisitiveness and commerce, especially when we get to the early modern period. The Renaissance was a time when people had, to quote one scholar, the desire to acquire. So they were always looking for new and interesting, and I'll use their word, exotic, things to acquire. And so coffee became one of those. I don't think they actually liked it in the beginning, I must be honest with you, especially in Europe, but it became, so it tells partly the story of acquisitiveness and commerce, and the rise of global commerce. It's about the history of travel literature. Coffee was a literary commodity in Europe long before, well, not long, but a while before it actually arrived. Coffee as a commodity, so was travel literature. Travel literature was very much commodified. People wanted these stories. They wanted to hear, for any of you, if you've read like the Tales of John Mandeville, right? He probably went no further than his local library, to quote one scholar. But, he wrote about people who hopped around on one large foot. Right. And people just sort of ate this stuff up. There are people whose heads were in the middle of their chests, just could not, because the people outside, people of the East must be strange. And then, of course, it's about legal, medical, and religious history. And I'm actually going to, Ibn Sina, for all of you, Avicenna is probably how he's more commonly known. He extolled the virtues of coffee in his book of pharmacology in the 10th century. And said that it was very good in illness, especially for stomach ailments. I am not thinking that that's right, with all due respect to Ibn Sina, but there you are. So coffee, and I'll talk a little bit about the archaeological beginnings, but the truth is that coffee has sort of these mythical origins, and I'm going to just tell a couple of my favorites. Yes, those are goats standing on top of coffee bushes, pushing down coffee beans. If any of you have been to Morocco, they get goats to climb the argan trees. So like argan oil and the nuts, right? the goats climb these trees and they jump up and down and the nuts fall to the ground. They're absolutely hilarious. The first time I saw it in Morocco, I thought it was a joke for the tourists, but it turned out, no, that's really what they do. So perhaps the most famous legend is the Ethiopian goat herd Kaldi, who was dozing off, I guess, or whatever, one day when he was, and while he was watching his goats. And when he looked up, they were eating these little red berries, and then they started jumping around. So Kaldi, curious, of course, to see what it was, tasted the beans, and the story continues that, quote, poetry and song spilled out of him. The legend ends here, but I can only imagine that he must have talked to friends and relatives about it, or coffee would have had a very short shelf life indeed. Another one of my favorite stories is about a young man who had improper conduct towards the daughter of a king, and he was banished and the king intended for him to die of starvation. And he survived by drinking, quote, a decoction of the beans. And that after surviving his exile, he took the beans with him on a pilgrimage to Mecca and was a hero. So he survived being banished and became something of a hero. And there's one sort of final story told by Al-Ghazi, who claimed that when Solomon came to a village stricken by plague, the angel Gabriel himself ordered Solomon to, quote, roast Yemeni coffee beans, from which is brewed a beverage that restore the sick to health. So that story actually from Al-Ghazi came about in about the 10th century. So, you know, sometime after Solomon, what can I say? But anyway, I think, and there are other legends, but those are my personal favorites. They're the ones I tell sort of all the time. In truth, the plant is millennia old. Archaeologists that have dated it, it's millennia old, and that it grew wild long before it ever was cultivated. And I was sort of contemplating this quite a while ago. It wasn't unusual for people a long time ago to watch the animals and what they ate to know if it was safe. So if the animals dropped dead, bad idea, right? So the story of Kaldi is not completely unheard of, right? Because that red is, unless you're familiar with a pomegranate, that red could be, you know, dicey. And so the idea that they watched the animals and if they didn't drop dead, okay, let's give it a try. And it was through trial and error that they discovered that you didn't want to eat the raw beans, but that it was better sort of ground up. And that's in Ethiopia. And sometime around 525 CE, the Aksumite army, the Ethiopian Aksumite army, invaded Yemen, taking with them coffee beans and coffee plants, which they planted in Yemen. And so the story of coffee really, it begins in Ethiopia, but it sort of explodes with when it arrived in the early 6th century in Yemen. And if you look at the highlands of Ethiopia and the highlands of Yemen, which Yemen has not been on the menu in a really long time, but just as soon as it's safe, I will be going to see these for myself. It's and for commercial reasons, it was actually Yemen that was the seat of the coffee trade. So that's kind of coffee, right? So then what happened? Well, there's one of my students. You can see him up there doing his very best Lawrence of Arabia. He's actually in Jordan in Wadi Rum. I'm on another camel. I include the bottom picture just because in that image are myself, I'm Catholic, friends of mine, the family, the wife and 2 children are Jewish, and then sitting behind me is a friend of mine who's Muslim. And I tell my students and my friends that this is cooperation in the Middle East at its finest. So I try to always get that picture in. So sometime in the 14th or 15th century, coffee appeared as part of Sufi mystic ritual religious practice. And the Sufi had a preference for these long nocturnal rituals that included whirling, as you know, and prayer and chant, and that in order to stay awake for them for this, they drank coffee. So that from coffee being a private pleasure, it looks like its next step into something sort of pseudo-public was with these Sufi rituals. And I read an article about some Jewish religious practice, and they also used coffee when they were up late into the night praying. So from a private pleasure and from these religious rituals, I argue we ultimately get the birth of the coffee house. So it started at home, then it kind of expanded a little bit, and finally, as you know, people started drinking it in public in what would become the coffee house. There's one scholar whose name escapes me at this moment who said that coffee houses were born because men needed a place to go to get out of the house. So I don't know if that's true or not, but there you go. And coffee houses, as you know, certainly in the East, are predominantly places of socializing for men. Today, they include, you know, places where you can hear the news and all kinds of different activities. But there is one coffee house. There's a coffee house in Meknes, Morocco, that is only for women. It's the women's coffee house. I used to love to hang out there when I was teaching there one summer. And when men would come in, you know, we would look at them with suspicion. Like, you have 15 other coffee houses. Move on. Leave ours to us, please. So coffee made its literary debut in Europe in 1575 with the writings of the German physician Leonhard Rauwolf. And so between 1573 and 1575, Dr. Rauwolf traveled to Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, and he left behind a memoir of his travels. And he wrote the following after his encounter with a quote unquote unusual beverage in Aleppo, Syria. And this is what he said. It was, quote, consumed in the morning, early in open places, before everybody, without any fear or regard, out of china cups, as hot as they can stand it. They put it to their lips and drink but a little at a time. So that is how he described coffee, and he had never seen anything like it. And so he wrote this in his diary, in his journal, and you can read it still today. A contemporary of Rauwolf was a man named Prospero AlBini. He spent some time as the ambassador to the Venetian, some time as serving the Venetian ambassador in Egypt, and he wrote De Medicina Aegyptorum and De Plantis Aegypti, and he wrote about coffee beans in that as well. So did the the English Shirley brothers. They wrote about it, and they said about Aleppo also, it's where they have fair houses where this coffee is sold. Thither gentlemen and gallants resort daily. So they were surprised. And I want to say, before I talk about coffee and its anxieties, I want to say a thing about the Yemeni port of Mocha. The Yemeni port of Mocha, Yemen had a monopoly until the 1600s on coffee exportation. And they only exported the beans. They did not export the plants because, of course, if you export the plants, other people can grow them. And so it turns out, or as the story goes, a Portuguese merchant stole one of the plants from the port of Mocha, and that's how it ultimately became cultivated in other places. But they jealously guarded their trade. And for the longest time, it was very lucrative because people, of course, started to want it. Coffee, of course, had... Yes.
I've got a question. I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt.
Yay!
Couple of things came to mind when you were talking about number one, the women's only coffee house.
Mm-hmm.
Was that just something that they just had on their own, or was that out of any sort of necessity for any sort of rules in society that the male and females couldn't mix, or was it just, this is our space, we want it, just give us our space, period?
Generally speaking, in the Muslim world, men and women do not socialize together outside of like family functions, right? So if you have a gathering at your home or with family or a wedding, but even then kind of women do their thing and men do their thing. It's really interesting. And the women, I think, saw that the men had these coffee houses and these places where they could go. And a woman in McNess decided, well, by golly, I'm going to open one of my own. And she was sort of like, and I say men are welcome, even though, I mean, and they are like technically, but this is kind of their place. And they bring their children and it's fantastic. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And then another question about the religious leaders, when they were introduced to coffee and started using that to stay awake for these long overnight practices or whatever they're doing, did they have, so they were using it themselves, was there any sort of religious practice or something about an actual preparation and drinking of the coffee, or was it just, I'm going to drink some coffee so I can stay up? What was it incorporated into the religion or ritual part of what they were doing?
It wasn't part of like the religious ritual, but there is a ritual to coffee preparation, and right, at which we know. So if you've had coffee, anywhere that you've had it, excuse me. I thought I muted my phone. There's a ritual to preparing it, right? And if you've had Arabic coffee, that's coffee grounds and water and a little bit of cardamom or something. And it's just a little bit of, I don't even know how and there's kind of sand on the bottom. Just kind of swirl it around. It's mesmerizing to me, right? And so that was the ritual of preparing it, but it wasn't part of the religious. It was just, this is how it is prepared.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Coffee produced a certain number of anxieties you can only imagine. I'm going to read this. There's a judicial pronouncement, 1675. The retailing of coffee might be an innocent trade, but as it was used to nourish sedition, spread lies, and scandalize great men, it might also be a common nuisance. And there were all kinds of women wrote about how men now were spending all this time in the coffee houses and they were very unhappy. The first set of anxieties, though, really came with Islam. And as you know, in both Judaism and Islam, no pork. Judaism, drinking is fine. Islam, alcohol is haram. It's forbidden. I don't know. The Christians, we eat and drink everything. I don't know how that happened. But so there was a question actually about whether or not coffee was licit, because it didn't make you intoxicated, but it was pretty clear that it kind of altered your body chemistry a little bit. And how does it look? And, there were just a lot of concerns. So the ulama, the religious community of religious scholars, ultimately got together and decided that coffee was just fine because it was not an intoxicant. The coffee house was a very different story. And the history goes that in Mecca in 1511, the religious leader of Mecca did not appreciate the coffee house. And he tried to ban them because men went to the coffee house instead of, quote, attending to their prayers. And it turns out, as near as we can tell, as near as I can tell, he wasn't as unhappy about the prayer neglecting as he was about the fact that they were talking trash about him in the coffee. So, the ban was spectacularly unsuccessful, and he realized that he could not keep them closed. So, and throughout sort of the Ottoman world after that, coffee houses, periodically, leaders would try to close the coffee houses, and none of them were successful because people will not be deterred from their coffee drinking. So with coffee arriving in sometime in the 1570s, the first coffee house in Venice is actually not until the 1600s, but it arrives, the beans and whatnot arrive in the latter part of the 1500s. And there was a concern, the late part of the 1500s, I should say. And there was a real concern among Catholic clergy about coffee. And they just didn't know if it was okay or, can people be drinking this? So the story goes that a Venetian merchant offered the Pope a cup of coffee. The Pope at the time was Clement VIII. He declared it delicious and suitable for Christian consumption and something that should not be left solely to the quote unquote infidels. So there you are. He also, as near as I can research, liked it because it didn't make people intoxicated. The Inquisition was not quite as hopeful about coffee, partly because one of the first places coffee beans were sold were apothecary shops in Venice, in places like Venice and Genoa. And people would gather at these apothecary shops that sold beans, and they would talk and they would read books. Right. And I mean, just the combination of people talking and drinking coffee and reading books was just almost more than anyone could possibly imagine. So from time to time, the apothecary shops got raided. But again, it didn't stop anybody. And then the first coffee house opens sometime in the mid 1600s. And I think that the coffee houses were so slow to come to Venice because of this whole sort of religious turmoil that was going on. The first coffee house reached England in 1652 when a man named Daniel Edwards brought with him a Ragusan Greek named Pasqua Rosé to make the coffee for everybody. And from there, it just sort of kind of took off. And so that's when we get to new patterns of socialization. And there you can see my family, and sometimes my students prefer this. But basically what happened is coffee sort of expanded and exploded, and people didn't have, and I maybe should have said this sooner, people in the West, people in the East came much sooner to the idea that you could eat and drink outside of the home. In Europe, people just didn't do that. There were taverns and there were places where travelers met, but that was kind of, people of ill repute, and they were brawling, and there was just not this idea that you gather to socialize and eat or drink in a public place. You may have a huge banquet, but it would still be at your home or your yard. And so the coffee house became this kind of novel way for people to socialize. And I argue that it was an adaptation from the East. It was not something the Europeans came up with on their own. It was definitely an adaptation. And they discovered that, wow, this is kind of nice, getting out of the house. Coffee is also a part of the history of exploitation. That's Cuba. In January of 2018, I took 15 students to Cuba. That's just outside of Trinidad. That's an old sugar plantation. Coffee, unfortunately, once it became popular and it started to be able to be grown in that list of places that I have there, it became part of plantation agriculture. So it became part of the system of exploitation and imperialism along with sugar. And we need to not forget that in so many ways, the history of coffee, like the history of sugar, like the history of chocolate, is about slave labor. Which leads to the final thought, and that's coffee and fair trade. And so when I got the anonymous reviews back, and I sort of stopped with coffee with coffee in England, and one of the anonymous reviewers, God love him, said, wait, there's more to the story that you need to tell more. So I did. I went back and researched a little bit about how the first coffee houses came to New York and Philadelphia in the United States, in the colonial US, and that they may have gathered to talk about revolution. It's possible. And all of this sort of thinking about what has happened with coffee and exploitation and whatnot got me thinking about coffee today. And so I end with fair trade. And what I think is a really important I think something really important, at least for me, and that is that we think about where our coffee comes from. Is it sustainable? Are people getting paid a living wage? Is it environmentally sustainable for people? And so as coffee continues to be 80%, I think 80% of people drink coffee are people that work on these coffee farms being paid a living wage. Is it sustainable? And that raises another question about equity, actually. And that's it. Very often fair trade coffee, and as fair trade other products, are more expensive. And so then does it make them unattainable for people that cannot afford it but would like to? And it just, to me, raises a lot of these kind of ethical questions that we do take up every other spring in my history of food class. And the students and I try to grapple with which I think are really important issues. And that's my presentation, which I probably went way over. And for that, Renee, I humbly apologize. But I would like to stop screen sharing and just invite all of you to ask questions or just share your thoughts. Can we do that? Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll just remind you, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. I think we have, let's see, we have, I don't have one yet. Or you could, unmute your mic and ask a question too. We don't have so many people, I don't think, that would be talking over each other. Just keep that in mind.
No, just shout it out.
Shout it out.
Or maybe you have a story about coffee. I'd love to hear people's stories about coffee.
I don't have a story about coffee, but in looking through your book too, it's almost something, coffee, I drink it every day, and you have these coffee houses, and you have this ritual, and you have this socialization, and you have this, or at least I have my morning ritual, which involves coffee. And it just really made you think, how long it's been around and people have been using it. And I really enjoyed, learning more about it. And I'm glad you included the fair trade part and kind of the equitableness of fair trade products and that kind of thing. One question I'll throw it out there is about fair trade. What do you see as the future of that, or other products that, other than coffee, that are experiencing that sort of, people are looking for this kind of stuff and want to promote it and purchase it when they can?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Chocolate is definitely one of them, right? And so even now, I usually buy fair trade. I always buy fair trade chocolate chips, whatever. And what I noticed as I was checking the back of some bags, even some of the larger chocolate manufacturers like Ghirardelli are starting to say they're fair trade. So that's really good. There's an NPR piece from several years ago on chocolate farmers in the Ivory Coast. They had never tasted chocolate. They harvested cacao pods and the cacao beans, and they had never tasted chocolate because they couldn't afford it. It was too expensive. And they didn't know that that's what they were harvesting became. To me, that's appalling. Pardon?
Oh, I was on mute. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
That's unimaginable to not,
isn't
be
it
able
though?
to enjoy that. Something so fabulous too.
So I think it's that. I think that there are, and then we have a random question about decaf. Oh, I don't know. Gotta think about that for a second. But yeah, there's fair trade now in just about everything, right? And I tell my students, even fair trade, like you go to the farmer's market and support your local CSA, right? It's just thinking about where does our food come from, and who is our need to have it causing suffering.
Okay.
So when was decaf invented? That is such a great question. Leave it to someone to ask a question I can't answer. I'll tell you what, it's a 20th century thing for sure. And I have a really good friend who it is to watch him make coffee in the morning is mesmerizing, right? Absolutely mesmerizing. Like, I don't even care what you do, but I just want to watch you swirl it around. And it's where I stay when I'm in the Middle East in Bethlehem. And it's really fun. And so like, why would you want decaf, Jeanette? Somebody wanted decaf the other day. I said, he has a travel company. And he said, one of the guests asked if they could get decaf after lunch. And I said, because
that question. And
what we have, do you know, Carolyn, when, I'm sure it's 20th century though.
I don't know, but I'm so grateful for it because I love the flavor of coffee and I can only drink decaf because of my acid reflux. So it's like 2 years ago, I had to completely switch to decaf and I still am able to find some really good decaf blends. And so I'm really grateful for it, but I would love to know how they do it or just when someone had the idea because it's an awesome idea because if you like the flavor of it, it's the best option if you can't have caffeine.
It is. My daughter doesn't like coffee, but she likes the smell, which is really interesting.
That's funny.
I know. I raised a child who doesn't like coffee. How did that happen? But my son-in-law does. So yeah, I don't know. It's a chemical. I do know it's a chemical process that has to do with leaching the beans, and I think it started out as a process using lye. Ooh, I know, right? Sounds super unappealing, but Renee saying her husband likes the smell. Yeah, that's all I know is that it's a chemical process. And like I said, somewhere in the far recesses of my memory are that it started with, and they used lye or some other really astringent chemical to get rid of the caffeine. And now I think they do it better. So yeah, there you go. That's what I know. Okay.
I'll throw out another question unless somebody else wants to.
Joanne has one about the third wave of coffee.
Oh, okay.
Can you be more specific, Joanne?
Sure. So I know that their movement started of we really wanted more high quality coffee, and that goes into what you're talking about for fair trade. I know that it's kind of a mixed camp because some people are like, oh, third wave coffee is so frou-frou, so fancy, so unattainable. But I think what's so interesting about it is just like this true appreciation for coffee rather than just, hey, it's the stuff that I put into a mug and it gets me through the day.
I'm a third waver then. Sorry. No, I am. I mean, I source my beans from all kinds of different places. You can get Yemeni coffee if you can afford it. Sometime I would encourage you. I think where I get it is called Conflict Coffee. And it does help farmers in war-torn Yemen to try to keep their businesses alive. So I don't think it's frou-frou at all. I think actually it's getting back to, I think third wave coffee is really original coffee. And then we started to mix it all up and it became things that I can't drink anymore because I'm a snob. Sorry.
Melissa has a question about, she asked, have people always drunk coffee with milk or sugar?
No, not at all. No way. Now sugar. So coffee was interestingly enough, coffee so it started, I think, in Guinea and parts of the Indian subcontinent, and it traveled the Silk Road. And as early as the 8th century CE, it was being refined in Jordan. And even then, and people just never put sugar in it. So that's a European thing to get rid of the bitter taste, is to add sugar because that's just not done. Milk, yeah, the Italians, right? But you don't drink a cafe latte after about 10 o'clock. I mean, no more milk after 10 o'clock, right? I mean, that's just 100% no. But sometimes on a really cold day, Yeah,
I
but
was wondering that myself.
Yeah.
You know, like it was black coffee is a standard, and
Mhm.
you know, talking about sugar, you know, regional preferences. You know, I always come back to the do you put sugar in your cornbread question, which is, you know, fighting words in some parts of the country, you know, whether you do or don't put sugar in your cornbread. So,
Oh no.
you know, I was just, you know, I had that same question that she had as, you know, who puts milk and sugar? I do, but because that's how it was first served to me. And that, you know, you talked about memories of coffee or stories of coffee. My grandmother, that's how she drank it. She was Danish, and that's how she drank it. And so that's how I learned how to drink it. But yeah, I imagine that, you know, there's some regional preferences and, you know, in different parts of the world. So
And
that's a good
certainly
question.
I mean, in large parts of the Middle East, they have a sweet tooth,
Oh,
a serious sweet tooth. If any of you have had things like kunafa, right? Right. Oh, I mean, to me, it's a food group, right? I love it, but it is so sweet, right? Baklava, same thing. It's just so sweet. And, but they don't put it in coffee. So how interesting is that? And I don't like my Arabic coffee with milk, although most days, just a little bit. I do need a little bit of milk. But I grew up drinking. I grew up with family that drink it black. So I don't
and
know.
I mean, part of that, you know, family, you know, how, that you grew up, you drank it how your family drank it.
Yeah.
Linda, you have a question also?
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm interested in the ritual, but you were talking about sweet, and I wanted to mention, I think I was in my late 40s when I first started drinking coffee. And sometime after that, I went out to eat at a Thai restaurant and was introduced to Thai coffee, which is sweetened with sweetened condensed milk.
Yes.
I thought it was the most wonderful thing. I think I probably had 3 servings. Life was never the same. my poor head. But talking about the rituals, when I first went to Buenos Aires, where my son lives, I waited for him at one point at a little cafe where they served coffee, and I ordered coffee, and I thought, this is really good stuff. And I was there a couple of more times, at least once more before I left. And I mentioned to the mother of a friend of his, I said, you've got really good coffee here. And she gave me a pound bag of the brand Bonafide. And I brought it home and I said, something's different. This isn't quite right. And it wasn't till later I figured out I had been drinking espresso when I was in Buenos Aires. And then my son came back to the States and brought a friend with him who was 100% Argentine. And he brought one of these little sock filters with him. And I was just fascinated. And I found one in our grocery store and tried it myself. Didn't have the patience. They put the coffee in the sock-like filter. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
And
But you
then
have to have the patience of Job.
hot water on it and stand there and wait for it to drip all the way through. And I'm like, this is lovely. I can't do it. But you know, it was fun. It was fascinating.
There's also
I do like ritual. I do need, you're inspiring me to get back into finding some sort of a middle ground.
a French press might be the middle ground.
Maybe so.
Maybe.
Maybe it's more just in being sure to take the time to get a nice cup and saucer, you know, and sit and make it a little more of a production than just on the counter, you know, a sip here and there.
The other thing I think to keep in mind when you travel and coffee tastes different is to think about the water and the mineralities and the water, because I noticed that, and I especially noticed this in olive oil. So I was making something, I think it was hummus, and this was several years ago, and I was just vexed about why my hummus didn't taste like it does when I make it in the Middle East. And I was just fit to be tied. So I was yakking with this friend of mine. I'm like, why doesn't it taste the same? And he said, it's the olive oil, Jeanette. You're using Italian olive oil, because I had run out of the olive oil that his family had sent home with me, and it tastes different. And so water, all of those kinds of things will change the taste. So if it tastes different, that's part of it also.
I can vouch for that. I live on a farm and we have spring water, and it's wonderful for drinking and cooking, and everything we use it for. But it's not for coffee.
Nope.
I have to
No way.
really I have to baby my coffee to make it taste right.
Soil and the water, all these things make a difference.
They make
Now,
a huge difference.
fascinating.
I will only use filtered water.
Well, you had touched on the idea of, that, what was the quote, desire to acquire that, I want something new, and this coffee is a luxury item type of, for the people that could afford it. What do you see anything that we have currently that may be considered a luxury item, or sort of on that, not as well accepted or easily accessible? Do you see something now that maybe in future generations or centuries that's going to be as, readily available or common, if I can use that term, as coffee is now? Do you have any predictions on something like that?
That's a really difficult one.
Oh, sorry.
Because of travel, it's pretty easy to get the here. You know what? Here's what I think. Actually, I think that there is a desire to get things from their original provenance. So let me use an example. The very best, while other places mine lapis lazuli, the best lapis in the world comes from a small part in the mountains of Afghanistan. True story. So I think that in all of this, moving away from mass production to what are local people making? What are the local women making, whether it's carpets, Berber carpets in Morocco, or lapis in Afghanistan, or, pearls. I think it's that desire to have things from where they come from originally, not these sort of knockoffs. This is what I think. I could be wrong, but this is what I think.
Okay, thank you. And that goes back to that, knowing where your stuff comes from, and that, buying local and supporting your, local farmers or your CSA. That's all. It all goes hand in hand.
I just think it does. Either that, or there's a product out there that I don't know about yet, and I might have to find. Travel for it someday when we're not grounded anymore. Oh, it's been horrible.
It's been hard on those that like to travel, and it's something to look forward to.
Yes.
When it's time to do that again. Let's see if there's any questions in the chat. Olive oil tasting at the library.
Ooh.
I miss that.
That's interesting. What were the different? Can you tell us a little bit about that, Carolyn?
Yeah, so it was just one of the, pre-COVID, one of the where, free sign up, go. And they have in Fayetteville, we have this, well, actually, I don't even know if it's still open because so many businesses have closed now, but we have this olive oil specialty store on our square that I cannot for the life of me remember the name, but they sell specialty olive oil. So just a bunch of different flavors and balsamic vinegars and all kinds of things. And I guess the ladies who run it did a talk at the library, and they brought examples of some of their olive oils, and then they brought examples of the olive oils that you might buy at the store, like the, you know, Athenos brand, or just like the very general grocery store brands, and kind of explained the difference of, you know, how olive oil is, what is the word I'm looking for? Like labeled, like something can be called olive oil when really it's really not, mostly olive oil. So they brought little tasting cups and they poured, you know, the cheapest store brand that says it's extra virgin, and then, you know, the popular brand that says it's extra virgin, and then first press, cold press, high quality, and a couple different variations. And we got to sip them, and you actually drink the olive oil like you would wine. You do it through your teeth. You want to like let it, you know, air infuse your mouth, and then it has a spiciness at the back. So you could taste the cheap olive oils that aren't really even olive oils and mostly are just canola or vegetable oil, have no real flavor, and they don't have that spicy bite at the end when you swallow it. So then you get to the nicer ones, and it's truly like drinking wine. It's like you can taste the difference. You can feel it in the mouth feel. It was also interesting. So I'm not exactly an olive oil expert or like an olive oil snob, but I won't buy the Walmart brands anymore. Now that
See, so kind of,
kind of.
but you also don't have to use as much. I'm sure you have found that to be true.
Well, before, and this was another thing I learned, I was using olive oil for everything. Like I would roast vegetables at 425 in olive oil. And I've since learned from chef friends that you don't need to go that high heat on olive oil. So now I typically just use it for dipping and for marinades and for like salad dressings and things. But I roast all my vegetables now in grapeseed oil. That's my new,
That's what I do. I use mostly grapeseed oil if I'm going to roast at high heat.
Yes.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
What is this sugar and cornbread thing?
Oh, it's a Southern thing.
Okay, well, see, I live in Montana and I'm originally from Northern California. So I have to understand if I'm doing it wrong. I think I put sugar in my cornbread.
Have you ever used Jiffy?
Yeah.
Okay, Jiffy has some sugar in it. Naturally, it's one of the sweeter ones that you don't really have to add anything to. But if you make a homemade Southern recipe, a lot of the times they'll call for sugar.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
It depends on who you ask. I have when I'm serious. I'm not from the South, but I've lived here a long time. And there's a neighbor that we have. She's 89, and if we get on the subject of cornbread, you know, it's just very, you know, yeah, you put a little sugar in there. Oh yeah. Oh, she just sits there and just shakes her head like, oh no, you know. And you don't use flour either. It's all cornmeal, no flour to cut, you know. So it's just one of those things. We had a book discussion not too long ago. We discussed a book on, yeah, had different recipes and stuff, and that was one of the topics that he discussed with different chefs throughout the South, was the sugar in the cornbread. And it was just fascinating that, you know, oh, that's a northern thing that you don't, or you do, or it's a southern thing. People get really feisty about it. But you know, we all have our own recipes for things and how we like them and want to make them. And I'm put a little sugar in mine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to.
Yeah.
I take this stuff down for when I teach my food history class. I'm doing it in the spring. Yeah, and I bring food. I think this year I'm gonna have to have hand sanitizer and gloves and masks. But what's a food history class without food, right? You got to do it. So I'm going to talk to them. They had a big debate of the first time I taught it about whether a hot dog was a sandwich. So then there had to be much sandwich and hot dog tasting because they had to come to this conclusion. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's really these kind of, regional variation. And people think that there are international variations. I said, but no, all across this country. They're in New Orleans. Have any of you had coffee in New Orleans that has chicory in it? That's different again. It's good, but it's different.
But it is different. Well, that kind of leads me to, unless somebody else has another question, might be our last question. Is there another food topic that you plan to research or want to do another book on?
There are several. Yeah. I think that there are some unanswered questions about coffee. There's an awful lot of literature of Europeans writing about their encounters with the East, but how those interactions look like with people from the East looking at the West. There's some information, but not a lot. So I would like to try to study those encounters a little bit better. I would like to do something on the wine industry. You know, wine is originally a product of the country of Georgia. And so I'd like to do a little more research on that. And yeah, don't know.
It sounds like you've got options.
I'm always
options.
thinking of things that
Yeah, maybe it's the problem or the hard thing might be to
maybe
decide.
we need to talk about it, or maybe we just need to eat it.
Yeah, do wine. Yeah, we got a couple of votes for the wine.
For the wine, okay. I can,
Okay.
yeah, I might have to think about that whole wine thing. So I'm Italian. Give me a break.
There you go. But
Some
it
sort of brainstorming.
originated in Georgia. That's interesting.
It did. It originated in Georgia, or at least as near as scientists know. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Fregulia, we are coming up on 7 o'clock. So if somebody, if we don't have any more questions, I'll just take this time to say thank you again for your time and for your book. For those of you that are in Fayetteville, we've got a copy of the book that you can check out. uapress.com also has the book for sale, and this title and some of their other recent releases are on sale right now. So just keep that in mind. I personally really enjoyed the book, and appreciate your time, Dr. Fregulia. It's been a pleasure.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Renee. Thank you. This has been my pleasure. And thank you to all of you. You're wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Everyone,
you so
have a
much.
great night.
You also. Thank you.